You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, because I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
That, of course, was a recording of Dr. Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech that he gave there. He was at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., addressing literally a throng that was on the mall of the nation's capital that day. He made the statement, he said, that he dreamed of a day when his 4 children would grow up in a nation where they were judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And yet, as I was listening to the election results last night, of course, you're listening to the Friday, November 9th, 2018 episode of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. But at the present time, it is Wednesday, the 7th, the day after the midterm elections, which were on Tuesday the 6th. And I'm recording this special election recap issue of our TBR radio program. But as I was watching the election returns last night, I was watching Fox News and CNN and flipping back and forth between the two. But I'll be honest, I spent most of my time at Fox News because CNN just makes... I can't hardly even stand to watch CNN anymore. It's just become so bad the way they present things over there anymore. I can't hardly stand to watch it. But I was watching the election returns, and on both networks, even on Fox, Democrats that were just blathering on and on and on about all of the women that were elected to the House of Representatives, all of the Latinos that were elected, all of the blacks that were elected, all of the Muslims that were elected, all of the Asians that were elected. Dr. King said that he wanted a nation where we were judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. Yet the Democrat Party has so just fractionalized into this identity politics, I don't know how else to describe it, where, again, they're bean counting. How many Muslims do we have? How many brown people do we have? How many black people do we have? How many yellow people do we have? How many women do we have? And so forth. That's not the vision. That wasn't the dream. But yet that's what liberalism has turned into. And so I thought to myself, you know what? I know somebody who was at that speech, somebody who has been a guest on this show in the past, somebody who's a dear friend to all of us, somebody who we all know, love, and trust, somebody who served 2 terms in the House of Representatives as a U.S. Congressman. Of course, before that, he was Cooter Davenport on the Dukes of Hazzard, starred in Smokey and the Bandit, starred in Moonrunners and some other shows as well. Of course, you all know now who I'm talking about. I'm talking about former Congressman Ben Jones. I thought, he was there when Dr. King gave the speech. He knew Dr. King, and he was part of the civil rights movement. And yet, at the same time, he's basically left the Democrat Party. Well, maybe the Democrat Party left him. But I thought, you know what, I'm going to call Cooter, and I'm going to get his thoughts on this. And later in the broadcast, we will have the recording of my phone call that I did with him earlier this afternoon. He was totally not expecting to be on the radio today. I kind of caught him by surprise, called him at home. I've got his home number. And he was gracious enough to give us some time there and to give us some commentary, some very insightful stuff, and we will get to it later in the broadcast. But what I want to do today is I just want to talk about the recent election, what happened, what does it mean for our country. Of course, some of the things that you're going to hear in today's broadcast may have changed between the time that I'm recording it and the time that it airs. Because, as I said, we're airing this on Friday, and I'm recording it on Wednesday. So, some things could change. There are still some races that the votes are still being counted or are being recounted. Some races have not yet been called. We're going to give some predictions that may or may not come out exactly the way we predict them. The numbers of seats may change, shift a few one way or the other. All of that is possible. But this is just a general recap, a general synopsis, and just some commentary to kind of help you put everything into perspective. Not only what's going on in our country, but as Southerners, and as Southerners who are in tune with our heritage and who are trying to preserve our heritage and our monuments and our Southern way of life, what do we do right now? And, what should we be thinking about and what should we be looking at? And so that's the purpose of today's show. And I hope it kind of helps you to put some things into perspective. In addition to talking to Ben Cooter Jones, I'm going to be talking with former NFL legend Paul Blair. He was our guest here just a few weeks ago on the show. And Paul's going to have some great insight on some things. I'm also going to be talking to Paul Angel. Of course, our regular listeners also know who Paul is. He's the executive editor of the Barnes Review magazine, which is the TBR and TBR Radio Presents. He's also one of the editors over at American Free Press. And so he's got a great perspective on this. Of course, he lives in the area of the nation's capital. He's right in the heart of all of this as it's going on. And he's going to provide some great perspective. Needless to say, America is broken. And the results of the election as we saw them was just proof that America is broken. And America needs the help of the God of its founders if America is to go back to its former self. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start with my conversation with Paul Angel, and then from there we'll go into the conversations that I was able to have with Paul Blair, and then finally with Ben Cooter Jones. Last I saw, they had secured 219 and they only needed 218. They may still pick up one or two more. They're touting this big red wave, this big blue wave. The truth is they're only going to have a majority of 2 or 3 seats. And
they're calling it the blue puddle.
Yeah. And
even the Democrats are disappointed, I think.
Yeah, and had there not been like 42 Republicans who just decided not to run for re-election, which was incomprehensible in my mind, because incumbents always get reelected. So the Republicans gave it away when 42 of them just said, we're not going to run again.
Right. I mean, even when you look at this, so there's 435. They all ran. They picked up 20 seats, which means they won 20 races, which would certainly, you'd think, at least 10%, 43, which would have given them a pretty big, it's funny when when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, they got to pick up X number of seats. But when you're at 50-50 and you lose one and they win one, you're not down one, you're down 2. So I would say that wasn't much of a victory. It was good that he's got the Senate, which means he can still fill a lot of these vacant judgeships, right, and have some control over the Supreme Court, which is good.
Yeah, and when you think about it, Obama lost, 68 seats?
Yeah. In
his first midterm election. Even factoring in the fact that there were, 40-some Republicans that just walked away. Trump, I don't think Trump's going to lose 30 seats.
Here where I am in central Virginia, generally speaking, red. Spanberger won, who was a Democrat. Of course, Corey Stewart had no chance. But that was one of the little districts that flip-flopped. And but the people here generally are Republican, conservative, Trump lovers. I thought that things would be worse. I thought they could lose the Senate, which they picked up a seat, which is pretty impressive, and they only lost 20 seats out of 435.
Well, yeah, but and there are like 4 Senate races that are still outstanding. 3, maybe all 4 of them will go to the Republicans, so they could end up with 54 seats, 55 seats.
Right.
I know Lindsey Graham said it on Fox News last night, and I listened to the radio today during the Laura Ingraham show. She had Mitch McConnell's press conference playing. And so in both cases, they both gave the Democrats the same warning. They said the game that you're threatening to play against President Trump right now, the whole harass the president, impeach the president, investigate and impeach the president's judicial appointments and so forth. They said, we played that same game with Bill Clinton in the 90s, and we lost. And we lost big. because we underestimated the popularity of a president who we didn't like and we just assumed the country didn't like. They said, and if you want to play this game with President Trump, go ahead, but you're going to end up with the same result because you're underestimating the popularity of this president and the fact that the people who elected him still love him.
Well, it's funny, and the way they word their poll statistics are funny, too. They said 4 out of 10 voters came out to vote against President Trump, 25% came out to support Trump. So that's 40% plus 25, 65. The other 35 claimed that they just came out to vote whoever they liked, right? But Trump's approval rating last time I checked was something like 51%. But I just hope it's not going to be gridlock. Of course, I noticed this huge change. Two of the big issues they're ready to push forward right now are campaign finance reform.
Right.
Structure yet. But, whatever. I don't know if this is going to work out as well as they thought, the Democrats.
Yeah. Well, I think Nancy Pelosi is going to be in for the shock of her life here in the next couple of months.
I don't think they want her.
Well, yeah, because, and normally the way it's going to work, too, is that, the incoming freshmen come in and the old people in the party, the Pelosi's and so forth, they sit them down and basically tell them how things are going to work there in Congress. But I think what you're going to see is all of these incoming Democrats, they're all young, very far left, openly socialist, they're millennials, and, they're just going to look at her when they're getting their welcome to the House of Representatives, now this is the way things work here speech, like, do you think you're an old woman? Get the hell out of the way. We're here and we're taking over.
Yeah, it's funny because not only that, but I remember what Pelosi said when Obama won, and they had a majority in the House and Senate, I think, didn't they both?
Yeah.
At one point. And she said, well, we're going to do things our way now, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's not really the way you go about doing it.
Yeah. So I don't think Pelosi and, the old leadership, the old guard leadership of the Democrat Party is going to be able to control these new Democrats that just got elected.
I still think most Americans are centrist and are looking for reasonable and generally conservative. Part of it might be a strategy, and maybe I'm wrong, but he does need to tone it down a little bit once in a while. He doesn't realize the number of people that he does turn off that want to like him,
right,
and like what he's doing. And sometimes I think he could really increase his appeal if he would just kind of tone it down a little bit. But whatever, that's what got him there. So,
Well, they say the same thing about the Barnes Review. They say more people would read us if we would tone it down. So.
Yeah, I know. I've always wondered about that, and obviously we haven't toned it down because the people that support us are like, don't tone it down. So it's going to stay that way.
Well, at some point we're going to have to interject a commercial for the Barnes Review magazine. So let's just go ahead and stick it in here. And then we'll be back here in about 60 seconds with Paul Angel, and we'll continue our conversation on the midterm elections and what it all means. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You wrote an editorial at the beginning of the magazine called Hope for the Future. And you said, yes, Hope has two beautiful daughters and their names are Anger and Courage. And you were quoting St. Augustine, actually.
One of the reasons that people cancel their subscriptions, it's not has to do with anything about the magazine in particular as far as its quality or the writing. It's because they need hope. And so much of what we're reporting is a correction of the historical record. And people say, listen, I just can't take all the bad news. So along with giving people the truth, you've got to give them a little bit of hope. And so I came across this quote from St. Augustine about hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger, that things are the way they are. And courage to make them the way they ought to be. Well, we're going to be coming across, there's no way to sugarcoat it. We don't sugarcoat too much here. Things are going to be tough here in the United States. And not only do we have a president who people insist has to be stopped and impeached and defamed and insulted simply because he took a policy of America First. A president that takes an America First approach to foreign, and not necessarily with him because he's been sucked into this Middle East and the wrong side, and the deep state players, I think, have also thwarted his efforts to make peace with China and Russia, which I think he really wanted to do when he came in. Things are a-changing. You know, one of the things we were talking about off air was the demographic situation in America and how that's going to change. And there's nothing much good to say about that. But there is hope because the United States is an amazing country. And a friend of mine, a teacher who taught at Southern Alabama, I think it was, university, used to say the United States changes you, you don't change the United States. I don't mind these waves of immigrants to some degree. I don't like the illegal immigrants. But ones that want to be Americans, those are the types of immigrants we want. Ones that want to adopt what our values are, be helpful if we were a little bit more homogenous. When you look behind the scenes and you see liberals, specifically radical liberals, wanting to change the fabric of this country as quickly and as radically as possible, we are a white Christian nation. We will be for a few more years. And, well, you have to ask what their agenda is. And then you have, and if their agenda is to disenfranchise us to some degree to where we become the minority and what we've built is handed over to another generation that is much unlike us, then we can have hope that that's going to turn out well. But we need to have anger at the people who are doing anything in their power to stay in power, to grab power, to hold power. And this is the Democratic Party for the most part. I hate to break it down like Democrats and Republicans because, let's face it, they're pretty much the same thing except for a few issues. But really the lines have been divided when you hear the Maxine Waters of the world and you hear the Lindsey Grahams of the world. I was never much of a fan of Lindsey Graham, a little bit more so after the Kavanaugh hearings when he finally stood up and said something gutsy. So hope for the future. But anger is the only thing that's going to get us going. Nothing else really does. I always say about the content for magazines and the Barnes Review specifically is that people love opinions and they love strong opinions. Oh, you can whack them over the head all day long with facts, but it doesn't seem to really have much effect on them. What they want to hear is some emotion. They want to hear what people really have to think without the filter of political correctness there. And when you listen to what they're saying or realizing the Democratic agenda now, and that is laid out in our editorial as what they're standing for and what they're really pushing for, then you need to get angry. And if you have the courage to stand up and speak, then anger and courage together are a pretty powerful combination. Looking at what the Democrats were pushing in their campaign, by the way, these campaign advertisements are so ridiculous. It's unbelievable. It's like every side presents themselves as angels from heaven while their opponents are devilish, saboteurs. Whereas pretty much they're all the same, as I said, except for a few issues. But when I looked at it, they're for like unrestricted abortion, really abortion on demand, a redistribution of wealth, which we know they want to do. Now, the welfare state, I don't know how else we're going to pay for throngs of aliens coming in here who are not trained to do jobs for us or to speak English even or adopt American ways or go out and work the way we used to work. Therefore, the vilification of men in general, which we discussed in the Barnes Review, white men in particular, but also white women, the vilification of our culture heroes, the vilification of our religious figures, or the tearing down of our religious rights, forcing a cake maker to make a cake, open borders. We know that one of the big things that this communist congresswoman from New York said, right, is she wants to abolish ICE immediately. You've got this weird gender confusion, dysphoria thing going on where people who were a kid might be 12 years old and decide he's a boy, right, but he wants to be a girl. Well, they say, go ahead, let's pay for the operation instead of doing what one doctor or psychiatrist actually says we should stop and talk to them and figure out how to make them comfortable in their own skin. Of course, people that would resist that particular push to jump on, I think it's a perversion in general to chop up on a healthy body, basically fired and run out of his job, and was very well respected for simply saying, before we go to radical methods for people that want to change their sexes, we should stop and talk to them and figure out what's going on in a psychological manner. Rejection of law and order. But we see what Antifa's doing. And of course, the mainstream media is on it. Antifa is the one that instigates most of the violence going out here. They're totally leftists. I would imagine they would have voted for Bernie Sanders, but they'll vote for any Democrat they can get their hands on. Anything to keep a guy like Trump, an old white man, out of office or impotent during his presidency. Mob rule, street violence. We've heard Maxine Waters here tell us that our lives should be made uncomfortable if they find us in a restaurant, and we should be I don't know if it's short of assault, or if she actually wants these people assaulted and physically thrown out of diners and restaurants who happen to be a spokesperson for the president, or maybe they're just a Trump supporter. It's weird. There's absolutely no tolerance. They used to preach tolerance to us for years and years and years, that this is the tolerance is the only thing that's going to pave the way for this new multicultural society. Yet they have no tolerance for any of us because we have a different opinion. They want to eliminate free speech for those who disagree. We know that because Media Matters for America, funded, originally started up with $1 million donation from George Soros, has released, I don't know if they did it on purpose or it was secretly released, their agenda for censoring every conservative voice they can get their hands on in the independent media and on the internet. And of course, the Democrats are working behind the scenes too. Mark Warner was pushing that internet censorship thing, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. So they want to basically shut down every other opinion but their own, which is rapid censorship. School campuses, certainly no longer places of free thought and free speech, have been increasingly radicalized and made pushed to the left further and further. Free speech zones now might be a quarter inch of space on a college campus where you might be able to fit and hand out a pamphlet. But if the pamphlet says, as I just saw recently this morning, it says it's okay to be white, well, that's terribly racist. But if it says Black Lives Matter, that's not. That's just a weird thing. It should be the same for everybody. We also have the smear campaigns. I mean, if you're anywhere right of Leon Trotsky, you're a Nazi, you're a hater, you're a killer, you're a enslaver, right? You're a privileged white person, which is ridiculous because most of the white people I know bend over backwards to make people of other religions, races, creeds, and colors comfortable and when they're around, especially when they're in a majority white setting. And they certainly don't go out and insult them. They're tolerant beyond belief. I think people need to get mad. I think they need to keep it under control and not get violent, of course. But their anger and combined with their courage could lead us to an era where we take back our free speech rights. We explore other options for uncensoring the internet. I mean, I really don't care as a conservative. I consider myself a conservative. Whether a leftist has a really ridiculous point of view. Maxine Waters is the perfect example. Great that she says what's on her mind. She's allowed to. I completely disagree with her on nearly every single thing, but certainly not I'm going to advocate muzzling the woman. It's just not the way the United States is. But it scares me a little bit, and that's where the fear comes in, to see a Democrat who's a communist. I mean, I didn't think that would happen quite so quickly. So we'll keep our eyes on things and encourage people to be mad when they should be mad and to have the courage it takes to get out there and vote and to keep on speaking their minds no matter what. So that's what that editorial was pretty much about.
What I'm going to do here is I'm going to break for a quick word from our sponsor, the American Free Press. Then what I'm going to do is we're going to come back with the audio clip of today's press conference. It was President Trump. And he was very rudely interrupted by Jim Acosta. Of course, Jim Acosta has just been very boorish, and that's a polite way to put it, at the White House press conferences for some time now. And finally, today, the president just put Jim Acosta in his place. And let me say that it was a beauty to watch it. And so we're going to play that. And then, of course, we'll have our interview with NFL legend and superstar Paul Blair. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net and find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to challenge you on one of the statements that you made in the tail end of the campaign in the midterms. That
here we go.
If you don't mind, Mr. President, that this caravan was an invasion. As you know, Mr. President,
I consider it to be an invasion.
As you know, Mr. President, the caravan was not an invasion. It's a group of migrants moving up from Central America towards the border with the U.S.
Thank you for telling me that. I appreciate it.
Why did you characterize it as such?
Because I consider it an invasion. You and I have a difference of opinion.
But do you think that you demonized immigrants in this election to try to keep?
I want them to come into the country, but they have to come in legally. You know, they have to come in, Jim, through a process. I want it to be a process, and I want people to come in, and we need the people.
Your campaign.
Wait. You know why we need the people, don't you? Because we have hundreds of companies moving in. We need the people.
But your campaign had an ad showing migrants climbing over walls and so on.
That's true. But they weren't actors.
They're not going to be doing that.
They weren't actors. Well, no, it's true. Do you think they were actors? They weren't actors. They didn't come from Hollywood. Right. These were people. This was an actual. It happened a few days ago. And
they're hundreds of miles away, though. They're hundreds and hundreds of miles away. That's not an invasion.
Honestly, I think you should let me run the country. You run CNN.
All right.
And if you did it well, your ratings would be much better.
If I may ask one other question, Mr. President, if I may ask one other question, are you worried?
That's enough. That's enough.
Mr. President, I was
enough.
going to ask one of the other folks.
That's enough.
Pardon me, ma'am. Mr. President,
that's enough.
Mr. President, I had one other question, if I may ask, on the Russia investigation. Are you concerned that you may have?
I'm not concerned about anything with the Russian investigation because it's a hoax. That's enough. Put down the mic.
Mr. President, are you worried about indictments coming down in this investigation?
Mr. President.
I'll tell you what, CNN should be ashamed of itself having you working for them. You are a rude, terrible person. You shouldn't be working for CNN. Go ahead.
I think that's unfair.
You're a very rude person. The way you treat Sarah Huckabee is horrible. And the way you treat other people are horrible. You shouldn't treat people that way. Go ahead. Go ahead, Peter. Go ahead.
In Jim's defense, I've traveled with him and watched him. He's a diligent reporter who busts his butt.
Well, I'm not a big fan of yours either, so
I understand.
To be honest.
So let me ask you a question, if I can. You repeatedly said
you aren't the best,
Mr. President. You repeatedly over the course of
just sit down, please. Well, when you report fake news, when you report fake news, which CNN does a lot, you are the enemy of the people. Go ahead,
Mr. President.
Yes, sir, Edward. How are you doing, buddy?
Oh, I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. Hey,
I know you were working really hard on that I-4 corridor, making a lot of flights back and forth from Oklahoma to Florida. Just wondering, now that the election's over and the results are pretty much in, what your thoughts were. Were you successful in those efforts? Were you unsuccessful? Was it a mixed bag there?
well, we'll see. You know, we actually were just now getting started in I-4, and then we were going to be, beginning in February, is where we're going to be beginning in earnest with our Liberty Pastor Training Camp. And I'm hoping that over the next 2 years, we can actually have maybe 400 or 500 pastors that have completed in the state of Florida, and then hopefully some other states. So we actually are just getting started. You know, when you consider how close these last couple of races have been, you know, both in 2016 and here, I think that our work in the state of Florida has probably made some difference. I don't know if it has been the difference maker, but I think it has helped. Anyway, I was thrilled Florida chose not to elect a socialist, a man that is a admitted socialist for governor. And that's one of the areas that we are going to be working on, trying to educate the populace as to what socialism is, because obviously this young generation hears the word and they think it's really something to be desired, and they don't realize it is just complete, absolute government tyrannical control and ownership of everything. And it results in what we're seeing in Venezuela, what we've seen in Cuba, what we saw in the Soviet Union and North Korea, every other country that has tried to implement socialism. All it results in is poverty, absolute totalitarian control. So that is not the direction we want to go in.
You know, one thing that grabbed my attention about last night was that Andrew Gillum actually conceded early, you know, considering how close the vote was. And then today, of course, Bill Nelson is calling for a recount in the Senate race and will not concede. But their margins are about the same. Yeah. So if nothing else, I guess maybe Gillum, despite his socialism, might be a little more gracious than Bill Nelson.
Well, maybe Nelson's at the end of his political career, and Gillum thinks he's at the beginning, so he's trying to, handle this with class, possibly. But, I don't know what the chance is of seeing a mistake of, 30,000 votes. I know back in the presidential election with President Bush, what was there? Like 500 votes was what they were trying to make sure were correct. I just can't imagine. Even though that's a small percentage, I can't imagine there being a 30-plus thousand vote swing. So I think Senator Nelson's wasting time, and I think Andrew Gillum made the right call.
One thing that concerns me, and I'm going to ask your opinion of it, just because it'll help us to understand how we have to think. Because in politics, things aren't black and white, they're not cut and dry. We would say that Rick Scott winning the Senate seat and not Bill Nelson is a victory. Right after the Parkland shooting, Rick Scott, already a lame duck governor, and even knowing he was going to run for Senate and he was going to need conservative votes to do it, he forces a bunch of gun control through the legislature. Is it a victory? It is, but at the same time, does he really stand where we stand? No, he doesn't. How do you...
No, that's right. Yeah.
How do you negotiate that?
Well, a couple of things. And one's the short-term reality and why it is a win is because even though the House... And by the way, the House of Representatives was not a surprise. You look back at the last many midterm elections, and the party in power always loses a significant number of seats in the House. And, we saw that, when President Obama was in office, he lost over 60 seats. So for the House to only have some 25 seats flip, that is certainly not any kind of a repudiation of Donald Trump. That was completely expected and, quite frankly, minimal and was not any kind of a blue wave. The thing that was really good about picking up a few seats with the Senate is we now, have a Republican president who, quite frankly, although many of us were skeptical of during the primaries, he has been as friendly towards Christianity as any president that I can remember having in office. But he has made some very good nominations for justices of the Supreme Court and different federal judges. He's done a really good job in selecting those, and we've seen just what kind of an influence the courts have in the direction of our country. We weren't designed to function that way in the Constitution. However, that is the way we are functioning in practice right now. That's the reality in which we currently live in until we change it. Trump still being able to, with his cabinet, being able to make adjustments to certain regulations, and then with Trump being able to appoint conservative constitutionalist judges and possibly even another 1 or 2 Supreme Court justices. Now having an extra, say, 3 or 4 Republicans in the Senate, that means that some of the more liberal Republican senators like Susan Collins and others can't hold these judges hostage. We know that a few of these have been very moderate when it comes to life issues. So even though Wilson is not exactly a strong, right, principled conservative, he at least, as it will caucus with the Republicans and presents himself as being pro-life and should give additional cushion for giving some of these really good judges appointed and confirmed. Now, that's where we are today. What we have to do over these next 2 years is really work in educating Christians in comprehensive biblical worldview. And the reality is, Marx's strategy was to try to create change through friction. He wanted the 99% battling the 1%. He wanted there to be racial strife. He wanted there to be union strife versus union workers and owners. And that's how he wanted to force change. What we've got to recognize, there's no such thing as black truth versus white truth or male truth versus female truth. There's just truth. There's just Jesus. There's the Word of God. And if we are Christians and profess to be followers of Jesus, then our worldview should reflect that. So we cannot support policies such as socialism, that all that is stealing from those that are working, absorb it itself or redistribute it. We cannot support policies that promote the murder of innocent children. We can't support policies that redefine marriage and make a mockery of God's design for the family. We can't support nonsense like man-made global climate change that has zero lick of scientific evidence behind it, and such things as transgender identity. Fact is, you're either a biological male or you're a biological female. That's not something that you can just flip a coin and decide at some point in life. Very important that we educate all Christians. And that's the thing that unites us. Race, quite frankly, as Ken Ham says, there's only one race. We're all humans. We're all descendants of Adam. So rather than falling into this trap of racial fighting, we need to just see what the Bible has to say about how we should approach the world of civil government, or the realm of civil government. And hopefully in 2 years, if we are successful in educating Christians to start thinking like Christians, we'll see a different type of candidate running in 2020, and we will see different results.
I know in addition to the I-4 corridor, where you've really been working hard to not only to train pastors and get them involved in that fight and in teaching that worldview and so forth. There in Oklahoma, in your home state there, with the gubernatorial campaign of Dan Fisher, I know y'all had this whole past year of using that as a platform to present that Christian worldview and to basically inject the Word of God into the into the political discourse of that state for the better part of the year. I mean, tell us at least. I know Dan did not win the governorship, but give me some of the success story, if you will, at least interjecting into the dialogue.
Well, it's difficult to change the status quo. We're not going to do it overnight, but as you said, we are advancing the football down the field, and this year was another significant success. I mean, Dan literally ran on a platform that would have included the exact opposite of what the governor-elect of Colorado just said. The governor-elect of Colorado said yesterday that even if Roe versus Wade is reversed, he will keep abortion legal in Colorado. Well, wait a second. I didn't think states could do that. Yes, states can, and that's exactly what Dan was trying to do here in the state of Oklahoma. Roe versus Wade is not law. Roe versus Wade was a misguided opinion. The Supreme Court can't create law. So what we were going to do with Dan is just actually enforce the law and end abortion in the state of Oklahoma, which the states can in fact do. What's interesting is that we had 36,000 people voted for Dan, and that was with virtually no money. I mean, Dan ran his whole campaign on about $350,000. And when you consider the millions that went into the other governor's races, Dan's message really resonated. So, it's a situation where it's like chopping a big, evergreen tree or cedar tree or something. They're not going to get it with one whack of the axe, but we put a good lick on it this year, and hopefully just with consistent training and retraining people to start thinking properly rather than the way we've been trained to think, that we're ruled by Washington, then, hopefully within our lifetimes, Edward, and hopefully sooner than that, we'll see great change, and we'll see the Holocaust of abortion come to an end in our generation.
Now, you had mentioned the governor-elect of Colorado. Do you realize that he is the first openly declared sodomite to be elected the governor of a state?
Oh, it's so sad. But see, that's again, we see the church has ceased to be salt anymore. We no longer are retarding corruption and decay. The church now is conforming to the world. So we've got these mega churches all over the place with tens and hundreds of thousands of members going to an hour-long experience each week, but we're not seeing disciples made. We don't see true followers of Christ. And the fact that that's going on in this day and age is an absolute shame. When you see some of these states in the Midwest that are changing, the reality is you see people leaving some of the real liberal states like California, and they're migrating to Colorado. And although they don't like what's going on in the state of California, so they come to a state like Colorado that has a better economic base for them, but they bring their bad values with them, and then they start voting their bad values. Next thing you know, Colorado looks just like California. We saw in the Ted Cruz race, that same thing is happening in Texas. We got countless businesses that have left California because of the incredibly high tax burden, and they've moved to Texas because Texas has zero state income. The bad thing is that as these people are migrating in from Texas, or from California, they're bringing their liberal values with them. And what they don't understand is once they implement that value system in Texas, then Texas will be bad for business, just as like what they were trying to flee. So that's why, I truly believe, Edward, that the key is trying to educate Christians to be critical thinkers. And then, of course, we can reach the rest of the populace. But we've got to understand, biblical worldview on economics, and biblical worldview on sexuality, biblical worldview and God's design for civil government. And if we can get Christians to start thinking like Christians, then perhaps we can stem this tide of liberalism that's sweeping the land.
You talked about Ted Cruz's race. His opponent was Beto O'Rourke. Did you hear Beto's concession speech?
I did not. What did he say?
He was dropping F-bombs in his concession speech.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah. That's why they couldn't show it on Fox News. I've got the video now.
Well, that's what's a shame. I mean, and you think about it, just in the last 2 decades. I mean, what was it? It was just about 20 years ago. The name has slipped me, but there was a leading Democratic candidate for president that was caught on a excursion with a woman that wasn't his wife. Because of that, he lost. I mean, his candidacy was done. His political career was over.
Gary Hart?
But see, that was just 20, 25, maybe 30 years ago. And now look how we've changed. Just in 30 years now, that's a non-issue for people. So, in the last 3 years, we've seen the Supreme Court illegally redefine the definition of marriage. And now seeing jewelry commercials and all sorts of commercials, advocating and celebrating same-sex marriage, have men proposing to men. It just is sickening that we no longer are ashamed of sin anymore. In fact, we are now at the point of celebrating it. But that's how far we have come in the last 2-3 decades. What's that?
Practically every television show now has a prominent gay character in it.
No, that's right. And see, they're trying to drive the culture, and that's why we're eroding so quickly, because one of the surveys, oh, good grief, I forget the name of the company. It'll come to me, I'm sure, as soon as we hang up. But just within the last year or two, did a survey of the populace, and they reported that 3.8% of the population was homosexual or identified as homosexual. Obviously, 96.2%, the overwhelming majority, was not. 3.8 was. But that same group, that when they were surveyed, they were asked the question, what percentage of the population do you think is homosexual? And that number was almost 25%.
Wow.
So, although in reality it's 3.8%, the perception is that 1 in 4 are homosexual. And that's because, as you watch television, as you see commercials, as you see, I used to watch a program called Beachfront Bargain Hunt. We'd see these couples leaving Minneapolis and relocating in the Caribbean, and it was kind of a fun deal to watch. Well, good grief, about every other episode you had a gay couple on there. See, they're driving this thought pattern, trying to recreate a new normal. And, when you consider how far we have eroded in the last couple of decades, I mean, we truly are in a moral freefall. So if the church doesn't stand up for godly truth now, boy, I fear for our kids. Like, not even our kids. We'll be living to see it. But the future of our country is dark.
Our founding fathers, had that vision of the United States being the city, set upon a hill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
But, Jesus asked the question about that. He said, but what if the salt has lost its savor?
Yep.
And, I think that's where we're at as a country.
No, absolutely. We can't be upset with lost people behaving like lost people. That's just natural. As you just stated, the salt in America has lost its savor. We no longer are light illuminating in the darkness, and we no longer are salt fighting the corruption and decay that's in our society. And instead, we're conforming to it as quickly as we can. And, basically, most are just churches in name only. They're little more than social clubs that profess to be biblically centered, which they certainly aren't. And that's what we need, as you know. And that's one of the reasons we're focusing so heavily, not only in our work in Oklahoma, but we are focusing heavy in Florida. Because Florida is a let's face it, how Florida goes the rest of the country. We have got to awaken the church. If the church doesn't become what the church is supposed to be, there is no hope for the future of America. We need a good old-fashioned great awakening in our generation. So, Lord willing, He will grant us that. If we pray hard enough and work hard enough, then maybe we will see it happen.
I'm going to ask you one more thing, and it's just something that popped into my mind here, is going into this election.
Yep.
And even in some of the commentary after the election, there is a lot of accusation against President Trump right now about being anti-Semitic. And of course, you had said he's probably about the friendliest president we've had in who knows when towards Christians. His daughter is Jewish, his son-in-law is Jewish, his grandchildren are Jewish. He recognized the embassy in Jerusalem, in the capital of Israel as being in Jerusalem, which no other president has had the courage to do. Where do they get that President Trump is anti-Semitic?
Well, that's part of the strategy of the other side. If you've read Marx's work, the Communist Manifesto, if you've read Rules for Radicals, the thing about the godless is they don't have any rules governing them. The ends justify the means. And if they have to lie or destroy someone's character like they did with Kavanaugh, or continue to say Trump is anti-Semitic, or Trump's a terrorist, Trump's Hitler, Trump's a fascist. They keep repeating a lie long enough and loud enough, unless we counter it more loudly with truth, eventually that kind of stuff will be accepted. The idea of the other side is generally they project on us what they actually are. So they call Christians or conservatives as terrorists and say we are intolerant. Well, the fact of the matter is the only real acts of terrorism being committed out there are by them, by the left. They're shouting down public figures in restaurants, going and actually shooting Republican representatives at a baseball practice. The only acts of intolerance is on the left. They're the ones that want to sue a Christian bakery into oblivion or sue a Christian florist into oblivion if we don't celebrate what the Bible says is sin, or celebrate allowing men shower with girls in locker rooms. So, and let's face it, we have seen that their side is the anti-Semitic side. It's not us, but they try to project what they are on us to make us the enemy. And we just can't let it happen. Again, that's part of where teaching Christians critical thinking skills is going to be so important, Edward. And of course, we saw during the Kavanaugh hearings, and as we are seeing now, all of these alleged accusers, their stories have completely fallen apart, and several of them have admitted that they were lying. Well, you know what? The Bible says, except at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let something be established. Somebody just comes out of the woodwork and shows up, a week before a Supreme Court nominee is supposed to be approved by the Senate, or a week before an election and comes up with some wild allegation. Well, we ought to be very suspicious about the timing of those things, and before we have some sort of a knee-jerk reaction, really employ some critical thinking skills and examine who the accusers are and why they might be making the accusation.
Well, one thing I found interesting was all of the Democrats who had voted against Kavanaugh. That all lost, and the Democrat who voted for him won.
Well, there is hope, you see. Not everybody has abandoned good sense. So people are paying attention. So we've got an opportunity to act. And quite frankly, I really believe, and again, one of the reasons we are focusing so heavy in the I-4 corridors, I think these next 2 years are going to be critical in how Florida literally leads the country when it comes to the White House and in many other areas, as so many people travel to and from the state of Florida for vacations and other things. That is a real key stretch from Daytona down to Tampa. And if we can begin there and reawaken true Christianity and reawaken the church to be what it was supposed to be, then perhaps we can see some real long-term change over these next couple of years.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and getting your thoughts on some of these things.
Glad to do it. I'm glad to do it, my friend. Just call me anytime.
Breaker one, might be crazy, but I ain't dumb. Crazy Cooter coming at you. Hey, y'all, got your ears on? Well, I got some news for you. We're here at a brand new Cooters in the Country store in Sperryville, Virginia. Good old Sperryville, where Cooters started many years ago. Folks are coming from all over Hazard County, and we're going to have a grand old time with good music, good food, and best of all, good friends. Hope y'all can be there. Whoop, whoop, here come Enos. Huck got Cletus with him. I'm down and I'm gone.
Of course, was our commercial for Ben Jones's Cooter's stores there, his Southern Heritage stores that he owns. And so I thought that would be a good lead-in for our discussion with Ben Cooter Jones.
Dixie Heritage.
Oh, hey, Ed. How are you doing?
Oh,
I'm
good.
fine.
Good. Thank you. I'm doing a post-election show that's actually going to go on Friday. What I'm thinking of leading with is Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, because I was watching the election returns last night on Fox News, and all the Democrats wanted to do was bean count how many women got elected, how many blacks got elected, how many Muslims got elected, how many Hispanics got elected. And I thought that the whole dream was to have a nation where you're not judged by the color of your skin, but the content of your character.
Right, where we get beyond that, beyond our labels.
And so I thought, you knew Dr. King, and you were in the civil rights movement, and you see where the Democrats have taken it, and I was just hoping to get a quick statement on the absurdity of identity politics.
Well, I think that's right. Nothing against anybody aspiring. You can do that in either party. That depends on your political philosophies, not your skin color and this and that.
Congressman Jones, Cooter, now that you're at this stage of life, what title do you prefer, Cooter, Congressman Jones, Ben?
I'm just Ben Jones, recovering politician, and of course Cooter is a permanent nickname, and we still have an awful lot of fun with that, Ed. This year, in January, it'll be 40 years since the Dukes of Hazzard came on the air, and it's still popular all over the United States and all over the world. So I answer to Cooter or Ben.
I'll say most of our listeners probably remember you as Cooter, so I guess I'll call you.
Right.
You were in Congress for 2 terms.
Right.
And you were in Congress as a Democrat, and before that, you were very active in the civil rights movement. And
that's correct. That's sort of how I got started in politics back when I was a kid. In the 1960s in the civil rights movement. And then I went to Atlanta from there and got more deeply involved in entertainment industry and in politics after the Dukes served a couple of terms in Congress. But right now I consider myself to be a political independent. I don't have a party label. So, and I like that independence. I try to think independently and free of any dictates of policy or party, and come to my own conclusions.
Well, that's part of the reason I sought you out for comment on this, is because the Democrat Party has moved considerably from where it was at when you were in Congress.
Yes, it has, I think that our problem, we've talked about this briefly before, is that both parties have become, the Democrats have gone further to the left, and it's exponential. It gets faster and faster. They're jumping over each other to see who can get further to the left. And the Republicans, being a conservative party, never change much. They might, have their more conservative people and this or that, but actually, I think Donald Trump is a populist, if I were going to call him anything, rather than a traditional conservative Republican. But nevertheless, there's no middle ground in the American discussion right now. There's no independent. There's no third party. So, there's just no in-between. And there appears there's no movement towards compromise or solutions, common sense solutions to the problems that face the country. So in a country of 330 million people, we've got 2 choices. And that seems to me to not what the founders of this country intended. But nevertheless, that is the situation we're in. And I think yesterday was a mixed bag as far as the results were concerned. The Democrats did pick up the House, but not by much. And the Republicans picked up a little bit in the Senate. So it wasn't a watershed election, and it really didn't tell us much except, that we're going to continue to butt heads.
When you were in the civil rights movement, of course, Dr. King's signature high water mark there probably was when he gave his speech on I Have a Dream that one day my children will live in a country where they're judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Yes, one of the greatest speeches I ever heard. A lot of that message has been forgotten. And the part where he spoke of, I have a dream that someday on the red clay hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will dine together at the table of brotherhood. We saw that happen, particularly in the South, where the races have come together and made enormous progress in the last 50 years since King spoke those words. We're not making progress now because those words have been forgotten. All of a sudden, we've gone back to this attacks on traditional culture in the South, on the descendants of the Confederacy. All that progress we've been made is at great risk because cultural cleansing and what's been called cultural Marxism is a terrible thing. And it's divided people up. It's divided black people and white people. And I think that the Democratic Party and its leadership is greatly responsible for that.
So do you think that the Democrat Party can move beyond, we'll call it identity politics, and truly recapture that vision that Dr. King put out there? Or do you...
No, I don't see that in the works for the near future. I certainly don't. Their whole thing is, let's see, if we get enough black people and we get enough Hispanics, and if we get enough urban people, and if we get enough gay people, and if we get enough women, then we'll have enough people to beat the Republican philosophy. The Republican Party is more based in, traditional values and simpler things, economic strength. But no, I don't think that, saying that Black Lives Matter, for example, is a good example. Well, all lives matter. I got up and said that once in a group, and they started booing me because I was saying that all lives matter. Every single human life matters, no matter if black, red, yellow, brown, white. It's just, we are a nation of immigrants and a nation of diversity by our nature. But that's not how you create a political philosophy. Just by getting a whole bunch of people together and say, we'll give you stuff, or we'll open the borders, or we'll, it's crazed. That is why, a lot of black people come to the Republican Party saying, here, my independence, my uniqueness is valued rather than my color.
Right.
You follow me? And it's what I believe, and the Republicans, I think, do a much better job of that. Because if you just say, okay, then what race are you? Well, come on in here. That's not a philosophy, and that doesn't create a future. It just divides people up rather than bringing them together.
Midterm congressman, and is somebody who's been a lifelong political activist and a lifelong student of history. What are your observations of yesterday's midterm election and where we're going from there?
I think we're in interesting times. It has been an interesting time. I think, this is just me, if Donald Trump were to just clean up his act a little bit, if he were less constantly aggressive towards his opponents and name-calling and all that stuff he does, it's a lot of fun and all that, but it hurts him, and it hurts the country. If he became more diplomatic, if he reaches out just a little bit, I'm not saying change anything he believes in, but change the way he conducts his business. And, just a little more discreet and a little less on Twitter and calling everybody names and, doing that sort of celebrity stuff he likes to do. If he just thinks about being the president, taking the high road, continuing with the same policies he's got, that he could win re-election easily, and that he'd be remembered as one of our greatest presidents, because he has enormous energy. I think he's got great instincts. I think he really does touch the American people, the traditions of America, and stand for something, which I don't see the Democratic Party really doing anymore. It doesn't really stand for anything. Diversity's fine, but we're all part of that diversity. And, I think the Republican Party is diverse too. So like I say, I'm an independent, but I think that Trump, if he, just softens his act a little bit, if he just takes it down a notch and speaks from his heart rather than from his anger, and just continues to work as hard as he does, that he can pull this country together, that he can build that bridge and bring people together so that we have a more rational and less angry national discussion.
Well, I definitely would like to see a little bit more civility in politics, because it's been rough.
Well, it has been, and this is also the choice that the Democrats have to make of how they're going. I assume Miss Pelosi will be the Speaker of the House again, and like I said, I've known her for 30 years or so. It has a lot to do with how she behaves, and if she reaches out to the president and says, "We really want to work together to calm calm this discussion of anger down and get some things that need to get done, working together," I think that's what the people want. So, I don't know, 2 years from now, I think if Trump just, tames his act down just a little bit and becomes a little more diplomatic, then he will be reelected easily. He'll take that away from his opponents. Here we go. It's going to be an interesting 2 years.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to give me some commentary on it. And
well, also, Ed, I think that our Southern heritage is more an issue than ever. I would like to see the president speak to that. I know a lot of his supporters are, people like me who are sick and tired of seeing the South attacked, of seeing the descendants of the Confederacy attacked, to see our traditions, our heritage, and our culture attacked. And I appreciate the job you're doing on that too, very much.
I'll say, well, thank you. I know you've been fighting this fight for a lot longer than I have. If you ever need a place to speak from, I'd be always happy to give you the platform.
Thank you, Chaplain Ed. I appreciate that, and all the best to you. And hope to be talking to you soon.
All right. Well, God bless you, Cooter.
And to you, sir. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
TBR Radio presents the Dixie Heritage Hour midterm election recap. I'm sitting here in the studio editing all of this and getting it ready so that it can go out on Friday. And I'm looking at my email, and I realized that at about 5 o'clock this evening, I received an email from Massachusetts gubernatorial candidate Dr. Scott Lively. And I had reached out to him earlier today. I tried to call him. I was hoping to record a segment with him on the election here and just kind of get some of his observations. Even though he did not win the gubernatorial election there in Massachusetts, the Republican candidate was Charlie Faker. Lively received close to roughly between 1/3 and 1/2 of the vote. He had a very respectable showing. But what was interesting, though, was that Dr. Lively received votes, thousands and thousands and thousands of votes, and those votes cost him just a couple of dollars per vote, whereas Charlie Baker was spending several $1,000s for every vote that he received. And that was just monumental, and I wanted to get Dr. Lively's commentary on that, as well as just his thoughts on the election and the results as a whole, and the fact that his state of Massachusetts could elect somebody like Pocahontas Elizabeth Warren and Charlie Faker Baker. But I missed him. I got his voicemail, and then he had sent me an email. He said, "Hey, you want to do the radio show? Let's do it." But I was already recording other segments. I was doing other things. And so I missed him, but I've also gotten back with him now by email. And we're going to have him as a guest here in an upcoming week, and we're going to give him the entire hour. And that's going to be a great interview. You're going to want to hear that. And, of course, next week our guest is going to be Paul Angel again, and we're going to give him the whole hour. And Paul and I are going to talk about the November-December issue of TBR magazine. And there's just some great articles in there. How in the world it happened, I don't know. But the editors decided to put 5 articles by yours truly in the upcoming magazine. And so we're going to talk about all of those. And it's just going to be some great stuff. So you'll want to tune in again next week. Anyways, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, thank you for tuning in. Come back next week. God bless.